My name is Brianne Hendrickson. Today I have Owen Wagner, Vice President and Senior Analysis, Grain and Oilseeds from RaboBank with us today. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Brianne. I appreciate being on your program.
So let's start off with just telling us about yourself and what you do.
Sure, happy to. So, as the name implies, I'm an analyst. I focus on questions that are relevant to agriculture, commodity markets. Of course, working for RaboBank, we're a Dutch domiciled bank. Within the Netherlands, we're sort of a full service bank, just like Wachovia or a Bank of America might be here in the United States. But internationally, we lend exclusively to food, agriculture, and energy transition clients. Here in the United States, I work across the entire spectrum of agriculture, both on the rural side, directly with farmers, but also in agribusiness. So it's a lot of fun. But I have a research role. I'm not a banker. I've spent my whole career in agriculture. Prior to joining RaboBank about a year ago, I was the CEO of the North Carolina Soybean Producers Association for about 4 years. Prior to that, I spent quite a few years with the British Agribusiness Consultancy. And then earlier in my career, I even got to spend a couple of years working with cranberry farmers up in Massachusetts. So an eclectic mix, but all related to agriculture.
What's your role in what you do now? Where are you based, I guess? Now that you've traveled a lot, where are you based?
Yeah, so sometimes I don't even know the answer to that myself. I travel quite a bit. And, no, I'm fortunate to be based in my hometown of Raleigh, North Carolina. So not necessarily the center of the universe as it pertains to grains and oilseeds, but we still have a lot of really good farmers, and we're one of the biggest, I think the biggest, as a matter of fact, corn and soybean producing state on the East Coast. So it's not a bad place to be. Of course, we've got a lot of livestock here as well.
All right, so let's kind of roll into this and let's talk about biofuel, which we've discussed a little bit before this. And let's talk about some of those policies, good old policies.
Yeah, that's right. Everyone loves to start with policies, right? So biofuels, I think people have a pretty good understanding of it, particularly for your audience who might be tuning in from places like Iowa, Minnesota, where you'll see it on billboards, you'll see it on the side of vehicles. If you fuel up at like a Casey's, for example, you have all of those suite of options in front of you in terms of the biofuel blends that you can elect to put in your vehicle. To get to where we are at today, which is a place of biofuels enjoys a pretty sizable market share. It hasn't been always been easy. It's been about 20 years in the making. So just to give your audience a little bit of a backgrounder on biofuel policy, it more or less began with the adoption of the renewable fuel standard, and that would have been about 20 years ago, 2002, I believe it was adopted. And what the RFS did was it essentially mandated certain production volumes of different fuel types, all made from biomass. So you had things like ethanol, biodiesel, cellulosic fuels, and initially they had some very long-term goals that were laid out that they were aiming to adhere to. They realized pretty quickly, I'm referring to Congress, who set those volumes with the help of input from the EPA. But they realized pretty quickly that, hey, this is a new science. We're going to need to show a little bit of flexibility in order to get this thing off the ground. And so, after a couple false starts of, not necessarily meeting those volume targets, they began to revisit those every sort of 3 years or so, 2 or 3 years. So we went from, biofuel production in this country to, single-digit millions of gallons prior to 2002 annually. And as of 2023, if you tally all these together, again, the ethanols, the biodiesels, you're looking at somewhere around 22, 23 billion gallons. So it's a very sizable part of the terrestrial fuel market. We've also had the introduction here more recently of something called the low carbon fuel standard in California, and they've been joined in the last couple of years by similar transportation mandates in Washington State and Oregon. And it wouldn't be any exaggeration to say that the LCFS has really been what's driven the explosive growth. Maybe that's not the best metaphor for a fuel, but the exciting growth, if you will, of biomass-based diesel, and more specifically renewable diesel, over the last couple of years. And so, but a critical difference between the LCFS of California and the RFS, that's the federal program, is that unlike the LCFS, unlike the RFS, the California program is fuel agnostic. So what do I mean by that? So the way the California program is structured, they are all about reducing CI, or carbon intensity scores, and they don't necessarily care how they get there. They just want to see that, okay, by their original goal was to reduce carbon intensity by 20% by 2030. They've already achieved that goal. And what we've seen is a little bit of a collapse in these sort of LCFS credits. And I don't think we need to get into those. It gets a little bit wonky, but that's basically the carrot that's meant to incentivize the production of these fuels that would otherwise be fairly, expensive to produce relative to the petroleum counterpart. So these LCFS credit values had kind of fallen during COVID, and the California legislature's answer to that was like, okay, well, if the values of these have collapsed, we've already met these goals, we need to be more aggressive in our targets. And what they're proposing right now is moving from that 20% reduction by 2030 to a net zero transportation emissions by 2045. So at first blush, that's pretty exciting, right? Because again, it's been these kinds of programs that have really driven massive amounts of investment in biomass-based diesel production, and we've also seen some more announcements about crush capacity to crush soybeans into meal and oil in this country to supply that vegetable oil for those processes. But the challenge is that all of these programs, whether it's the federal program or the California program, they are predicated on something called the GREET model. And I couldn't tell you what GREET stands for, but it's a model that was developed by the Department of Energy that models emissions over the lifespan of a fuel. So everywhere from extraction of that fuel to processing, or in the case of biofuels, any of the fertilizers that may have been used in the production of that fuel, all the way up to burning that fuel in a internal combustion engine to propel a vehicle. So it's comprehensive. That said, there have been plenty of critics along the way of that program, but I would just emphasize that criticisms aside, that is the model that is being used to drive policy. So I think it's a little bit of a wasted energy to try to untangle that or undo that at this point. I think some folks are still trying to undermine it or tweak it from a just sort of an advocacy standpoint. But it is safe to say that whatever issues people may have with the GREET model, that is still what's driving policy in under these key programs. So I bring up that model because the way that GREET models carbon intensity scores for biofuels and electric vehicles, the numbers that are produced out of that model are much more favorable to electric vehicles. And so by that, I mean they have lower carbon intensity scores relative to biomass-based diesel, and certainly relative to corn ethanol. It doesn't always treat corn ethanol especially favorable in that modeling exercise. So as we go forward in this California program, there's a state agency called the California Air Resource Board. Their job is to look at, say, all right, we've got this mandate or this directive from the California legislature that says zero emissions by 2045. How are we going to get there? And then their job is to kind of construct a fuel roadmap, if you will. And interestingly, and this, we could pause here for any questions you may have, but interestingly, the output of that scoping exercise is what they call it, shows ethanol consumption in California has actually peaked in probably 2018, and it's going to decline going forward. But the more worrisome thing, I think, is that it also shows biomass-based diesel consumption peaking in 2025 and then declining afterward. And why do I say worrisome? Well, it's because obviously, the audience of your program is, they're either direct stakeholders in agriculture or they're folks that are interested in ag. And, it's really hard to overstate the importance of biofuels to commodity markets. There's been a lot of academic studies done over the years, but more so for corn and ethanol than soybeans and biodiesel. But the number that researchers and now the EPA have sort of coalesced around is that for every 1 billion gallons of ethanol produced, it supports 3% of the price of corn. So there's about 15 billion gallons of ethanol times three. So it's somewhere between 40 and 45% of the value of corn is supported by ethanol markets. So it's pretty significant, very significant. If that were to go away tomorrow or even 5 years from now, the ag economy in this country would look very, very different. So we can take a pause there. But I would just add before we do that there's we're sort of teeing up this electric vehicle threat, if you will, that's being brought on by some of this California policy. But more recently, you've had the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, a big wonkish piece of legislation that was passed last year. It's very broad in scope, but there's about $240 billion of energy spending under that program. Only 10 billion of that is strictly speaking for biofuels. The vast majority would be for things like subsidies for electric vehicles, building out the energy grid, all sorts of money being spent to make electric vehicles more competitive long-term relative to internal combustion vehicles.
With this, California being the start of all of this, state-wise,
yes,
are we going to see other states start implementing this, or is California going to run with this for a little bit, see if it actually works, can they do it, and then go to other states? Are you already seeing states, little by little, start implementing things that California is doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And whether you agree with what California is doing or not, I would say anyone that's sort of a policy wonk would look at the California program and be like, hey, this is sort of elegant in the way that it works. So the RFS is it's more of a blunt tool. The RFS, again, being the federal program, that's a blunt tool that says, all right, you either go in sort of one of these three fuel buckets: ethanol, biomass-based diesel, or cellulosic. And then once you're put in one of those categories, there's not a whole lot of incentive to improve how you make that fuel. In the case of the RFS, however, it is all relative. It's a spectrum. So you can demonstrate to California that, okay, even though I'm a corn ethanol producer, I'm adopting all of these added technologies. I'm using less natural gas. I'm sequestering carbon in the ground. There are many things that these guys can do to demonstrate improvements relative to that GREET model baseline. So I'd say from that standpoint, the California model, again, to use the word I used earlier, it's elegant in that it allows it incentivizes improvement, not just across categories, but within fuel categories. States looking, that are maybe sort of like-minded politically, have looked at California, and they, I think, have broadly characterized that program as a success. So even though it's criticized, by folks that may look at this a bit differently, it has been successful in achieving its goals. Like I said, they're sort of ahead of schedule in terms of those CI reduction targets. They're so successful that they're now saying, all right, well, we're going to push even harder in that direction. So yes, there are two other states, Oregon and Washington State, that have joined. Washington State was this year. Oregon was just in the last couple of years, that now have a compliance mandate or a clean fuel mandate of their own. And the programs are structured very, very similarly to California's. I think, again, they're leaning heavily on this GREET model. There's some slight differences. Of course, when you're beginning a program anew, as Washington and Oregon are doing, they're going to be starting with, some of these less aggressive targets. So they're starting from ground zero, whereas California may already be 5-10 years ahead of these other states. So yes, we are seeing states adopt similar transportation mandates or mandates to reduce emissions associated with transportation, and whole, very comprehensive markets surrounding that. There's one other policy realm in which California has taken, I hesitate to use the term lead, but they're certainly taken the most aggressive stance on this policy, and that's they were, I guess, the founding member of something called the Advanced Clean Cars coalition, or however you want to characterize it. It's a group of essentially a dozen or 13 states that have some sorts of restrictions on emissions from vehicles. California took the unprecedented step this year when Governor Newsom announced that there would be no more sales of internal combustion engine vehicles in California beginning in 2035. Sorry, that applies to light duty vehicles only, so cars and trucks, not big rigs or school buses. They get a little bit more time. But the concern, I think, amongst biofuel interests is that, while right now California is the only state that's drawn a line in the sand and said no more internal combustion engine vehicles by X date, there are another dozen or so members of this ACC group, and there's a belief out there that some of these other states may follow suit and begin to adopt similar hard cutoffs for internal combustion vehicle sales.
Even though it's starting with the smaller vehicles, what is it going to do to the farming industry? Because we don't use small vehicles, what? And I know you can't predict the future and say, well, this is what's, but I mean, if they're starting with a small vehicle, what's going to stop them from going to the combine and saying, hey, we got to change, have they talked about that?
Yeah. So I actually just came from Farm Progress. I flew back from Illinois this morning. They have electric tractors that are available for sale today. They were on display, in fact, out in Illinois. They tend to be much smaller. So I'm not an expert in electric motors, but one thing that I can say about electric motors is that when they do run very efficiently at constant speed. So once you get a vehicle up and running, moving and just cruising down the highway, they do that very efficiently. But when you put a load or a torque on an electric motor, then the efficiency really falls through the floor. And it just, at that point, it loses a lot of the competitive advantage that it may have otherwise had relative to fossil fuels. And obviously, think about a tractor. That's all it does is generate torque to move through mud and pull heavy implements. So it is true that the natural starting point for an electric vehicle would be on something small and then work its way upward. But they are developing these vehicles. There's still a lot of work to be done for some of these heavy duty vehicles. But we've seen Tesla, for example, they've developed electric 18 wheelers that are capable of pulling, carrying a 18 ton load. And from what I heard, I was just listening to a podcast on this subject on the plane, is that they can go 500 miles in a charge. But then the question is, well, how long does it take to recharge? And still 500 miles for a trucker is not going to be adequate. They want to cover more ground in a day than that potentially. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, particularly at on the heavy industry side. But there are a lot of bright people looking into it.
What is this doing to the market? In everything happening.
Yeah, right it's been all of these biofuel and or renewable fuel incentives have been net positive for agriculture. We're not at the point yet where this has, where this is. I guess where the premiums are eroding or the benefits are eroding. This is still a growth story. But I wanted to begin by sort of highlighting this EV element because that is, it's happening, and we can debate on some of the finer points of what the timeline might look like, but it's happening. There's a lot of money that's being put into it, a lot of strong incentives. And that question is really what got us thinking about this sustainable aviation fuel concept. And that's where things get really, really exciting is, obviously you can put a battery in a car. We've been doing that successfully for, basically since the 90s, if not before, with, things like the Chevy Volt and that continues to grow more and more every year. But I don't know about you, Brianne, but I wouldn't want to get in an airplane with a battery. We're not there yet. These things are propelled 500 knots over an ocean, 20 tons over an ocean with hundreds of people on board. You want to stick with what you know and what works in that context. Also, airplanes are extremely expensive. Obviously, it's somewhere between $50 and $200 million to purchase an airplane. So you want to depreciate that asset as much as you can. You're not going to scrap that because, or even reconfigure it because the fuel, because you want to burn a cleaner fuel. That's just not an option. So when these airlines are trying to I guess be participants or good actors and reduce their own emissions. Right now, for them, the only the only viable solution is to use these SAFs, or sustainable aviation fuels.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Brianna. I appreciate the invitation.
For premium content, you can head over to the Comstock Report. Don't forget, hit that subscribe button.